Do you know much about the relationship between the biomarkers and Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I don't trust them.
No?
There some diseases where biomarkers are really good. I think we need more time to
So
understand.
it's just not fleshed out yet at the moment, you think, in your opinion?
I don't think they're worth looking at. So a good example is MS, where gadolinium lesions are really good biomarkers for MS attacks, which are really good biomarkers or really good symptoms or sequelae for disability. MS is bad because you get disabled over time. The attacks are these temporary weaknesses, which aren't really clinically meaningful, but they're signs that you're going to go downhill. And you can do this gadolinium lesion, which is just an MRI. And if your brain lights up with these gadolinium lesions, you can see, this person's got really bad gadolinium enhancing lesions. And then you give the drug and the lesions go away. And it's really cool. You see a 98% decline or 95 or 92% decline in lesions with some of these drugs. And then the attacks become less frequent. And over really long periods of time, the disability becomes less frequent. But the disability takes 5 or 10 years to see the difference, whereas the lesions take 5 minutes. Not 5 minutes, but they happen very quickly. So I think the Alzheimer's, we will inevitably find something like that where we see a really good biomarker that we can trust. As of now, we just don't have any successful phase 3s in Alzheimer's, so we don't know which would actually correlate to clinical success in a way that was reliable, but I do think it'll happen, whether it's A beta or tau or something will correlate really well. It's just too early to tell right now. And it's certainly too early for Cassava. I mean, for Cassava, the only thing you can really look at is there a clinical result? And I think that we're kind of far away from that, I think.
Just something I want to add from the statistics side is you see the effect size go down from the phase 2 to the phase 3 study a lot of the times because phase 2 studies are quote unquote underpowered, which is of course the case because they don't want to recruit a bunch of patients. But I think when you have false positives in a underpowered setting, the effect size that has to reject the null is going to be a huge effect size. And so that's why when you see it fail, you see basically a regression to the mean, right? And so the mean being 0, right? There's no effect. And so I think that's kind of underappreciated in that circumstance. And obviously replicability is very important. Obviously, you don't have money to replicate a phase 2 study, but I think that's kind of one thing that people have written about. I know John 𝗍𝗓𝗓 or whatever his name is written about that, where in Nature they find these huge effect sizes, and then they study it and they restudy it, and it actually goes down towards the null.
Yeah, I mean it's a lot like that old saying where you could see that the GDP of Bangladesh is correlated with the amount of computers that IBM shipped last quarter or something, and it's you can look backwards and see any correlation, but the important part is that there are causal forward-looking correlation. And, with a small enough sample size, you're going to see random noise all the time.
Also the fact that, we're trying so many phase 2 studies, and so just from kind of, type 1 error.
Right.
You have one phase 2 study out of every 20 that's going to be quote unquote successful, right? So
that's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, again, the Diamabond situation was really crazy. The effect size was so big that it was look, this thing would have to be virtual, complete, unmitigated fraud for this to be anything but a real drug. And Pfizer wrote a check for $300 million. They believed it too. And it was going to be the cheapest blockbuster drug ever for $300 million up front. And of course it didn't work, but yeah, I think so many of these people have never looked at biotech, and they're never going to look at it again after this. This is their first drug stock, and it's just not that interesting for them to look at another one. So
I think it's possible that maybe they might mark it up to $750 per pill as well.
Well, the price will probably be a lot more in terms of
Well, that's good for investors, right?
Well, the system basically will reimburse costs as the net benefit is conferred to the patient. So for example, in the case of 𝗟𝗩𝗪, this is a drug that costs around $50,000 for a full course. The price per pill is not that important. It's the full course of medicine, and it's a one-time course. So unlike other diseases where you have to take the drug for the rest of your life, you take 𝗟𝗪𝗪 once and you're done with it. And at $50,000, it represented a bargain. An Alzheimer's drug, I mean, we know actually the price of the new Alzheimer's drugs like donanemab, right? The price
I think they're like 20, 30,000 or something, right?
Annually it's 32,000, yeah.
Yeah, annually, sorry.
So 32,000 for donanemab, and you might be on donanemab for 5 years. So the question is, the thing about donanemab is donanemab was rationally designed for specific species of amyloid beta. The amyloid hypothesis is not a hypothesis. Amyloid hypothesis is simply true. When you have a mutation in amyloid processing enzymes, you literally get Alzheimer's. Amyloid beta is on chromosome 21. If you have trisomy 21, which is also known as Down syndrome, trisomy 21 gives you what's called a gene dosage of a 3:2 ratio of what you would normally get, because autosomal genes like amyloid beta precursor protein, you can basically get this 50% overdosage because you have 3 copies of the chromosome. So what ends up happening is you get this extra amyloid beta, 50% more, and then you end up getting, because of the amyloid deposition, you end up getting a Down syndrome form of autism. It's sort of Down syndrome dementia. So amyloid is 100% what causes Alzheimer's. The question is how. We don't know how. Somebody in chat's writing incorrectly that potentially it's a symptom of another problem. It's possible that that's kind of what's happening, where there is a fundamental breakdown in the autosomal, lysosomal sort of like process of breaking down some of the cellular debris, and that wear and tear aggregates over time, and it's just sort of this general breakdown. It's certainly possible, but we know it all starts with amyloid. There's no doubt about that. So
as much as we know now, I mean, if we know everything about Alzheimer's, which we don't, and I mean, from what we know, if we haven't found a cure yet, wouldn't it be a good argument that maybe the cure or a treatment would be something from left field, like something that's an outlier from what we've traditionally known?
Yeah, of course, the answer is of course, yes. But the problem is the line of thinking is incorrect. The thing about drugs is that they don't work by accident, that they're very deterministic. So when you see a clinical trial, you think of it like a poker hand, right? It's like, all right, well, I might have a 2 and a 7, but maybe a 7 will pop up on the river. I don't know if you play poker.
I do.
Yeah, so like, okay, sure, maybe everyone else has aces, kings, pocket 10s, but if I hit this 7 of spades, I'm made. That's kind of sometimes the way people think about it, but it really is, there's a better analogy. To get a drug to work in a complicated disease like Alzheimer's, there's a reason it hasn't happened yet, is because it's just as similar to landing a rocket that's descending from space upright onto a platform. Very, very difficult. It requires a lot of technology. Will it possibly land right side up on its own? Maybe. But if it's going to land up right side up every time, it has to be designed to do that, and it has to be designed exquisitely well with the right science behind it. It's possible it could work randomly, but it's very, very, very unlikely. And I think 𝗠𝗏𝗪𝗪 is a lot like that. In fact, I would argue that landing a rocket right side up on a platform that's come up from space is actually way, way easier than making a drug, landing a nanoparticle, which is in this case 𝗠𝗏𝗪𝗪, onto the right binding spot, which allows you to perfectly treat a disease. A lot of times, for example, we know the implication of amyloid beta in Alzheimer's, but there were dozens of drugs that failed to stop Alzheimer's, even though there was clear target engagement. There were even good phase 2 results. The phase 3 still failed. So you're dealing with a drug here that has no plausible way for it to work. It's not going to just randomly work. It's a little like the rocket, hoping the rocket lands right side up. It's not like the card flipping over. You don't have 52 cards in the deck. You have 52 billion cards in the deck. And maybe you'll draw one correctly, but it's unlikely. So I think that's, somebody's asking, how do you explain the minimal effect on CDR and ADAS in trials despite the validity of the hypothesis? Should we discontinue these drugs once amyloid is cleared? Well, I mean, there are some better effects now in donanemab. I think one of the biggest problems in the community of Alzheimer's is treating each amyloid species the same. And it's funny because it's not even the sort of amount of polymers or units in the polymer, whether it's a monomer, dimer, trimer, tetramer, or an oligomer, or dozens or hundreds of these, what sort of conformation they came in, but also even the post-translational modification of these proteins or peptides were relevant. So, I think that there's a enhanced understanding now that not all amyloid is created equal, and that's why donanemab, which is why the donanemab was approved and people are prescribing it, and et cetera, because it targets this very specific kind of amyloid. And the result was incredible. I'm just trying to get the 𝗕𝗢𝗢𝗚 results here.
Just a quick question. How would you explain people getting better in like the phase 2 or maintaining cognition? Like what would create a situation where that would happen and the drug isn't working?
Yeah, so that happens all the time. In fact, there's a litany of studies where you can see exactly that. If you look at every Alzheimer's study, you'll see that many times. Let me pull up a couple just to prove it. But
yeah, because from what I understand, looking at some of the charts that I've seen, the simufilam's phase 2 was like far better in aggregate than the placebos of the other approved Alzheimer's drugs.
The problem with that is that you're looking at open label data, right? So that already is kind of like, so it's very dangerous.
Because of the population size that open label wouldn't be good to look at, or what's the rationale behind that?
Well, open label data in general is thought to be very useless because it's not comparable to anything. The more patients, the better, no doubt about that. But there's no, it's really hard to sort of, get any meaning out of an uncontrolled study. So the Diamabond phase 2 is a really interesting example where there was this drug was proven to not work, but in the phase 2 there was a incredible improvement, in fact, not just stability, but improvement in ADAS-Cog. Yes, so in Diamabond's phase 2, at 26 weeks, Diamabond had an improvement in ADAS-Cog of 2 points, which...
And this was on mild patients?
I think it was mild to moderate.
Mild to moderate.
And by the way, you can't just throw out a group of patients, right? Like that's like one of the funniest things that you really can't just say, oh, these guys didn't do well, I don't want to look at them. That's just not a way to do science.
So wouldn't it be helpful, like, if maybe Alzheimer's went too far where it wasn't treatable? Like, wouldn't it still be beneficial to know whether it helped early or later?
Yeah, I think a priori, if you design the study that way, great. But, they did not do that. They designed the study, as mild to moderate. And they coulda, woulda, shoulda, but coulda, woulda, shoulda doesn't really work after the fact.
Yeah, But I mean, if you think that the drug is actually going to work, like you would want to try it on the entire population to see where it would work. You wouldn't want to just assume that it's just going to work on mild and not even try moderate, right?
I think that post hoc observations are basically, not, they're hypothesis building maybe, but like there just isn't much there. And again, there's no control group. So, it really isn't, really isn't that useful if you're not going to have a control group.
Sorry, I interrupted you before you were speaking about Diamabond.
Diamabond was like a well-known, a lot of people bet on Diamabond. Diamabond is like, it was really good in clinical trials, right? The clinical trial was like massively successful in phase 2. Phase 3 didn't work. And it's a really good case study. Cemiplimab in comparison, the amount of evidence Cemiplimab has compared to Diamabond is like, Cemiplimab is a 1, and Diamabond is like a 10. It had a perfect phase 2, met all primary endpoints, no patients were thrown out, like no controlled withdrawal study, just like clean, huge success. Diamabond, again, it was really a successful study in the phase 2. And it really makes like Cassava, it puts it to shame. Like it was super, super successful. And it still didn't make phase 3. The mechanism made a ton of sense. There was a 5-HT6 antagonism as well as a histamine antagonism that was thought to be potentially successful. A lot of Wall Street was convinced actually. So they made everyone for fools at the end. Bapinizumab was another one where Steve Cohen put a couple $2 billion on bapinizumab and very famously changed his mind simultaneously with his analyst getting insider info and ended up selling all his stock and then shorting it. So again, I think that, there's a gold standard for a reason. You just can't kind of hope that, a drug might work. It really has to, actually make sense, I think. And again, there are, you can, for an open label study, for example, you can put really healthy patients in the study if you wanted to. There are ways to do these clinical trials that skew the results. The way you do them that you can't skew the results is when you do a controlled trial in many centers in many countries. What happened with Diamabond, the reason Diamabond didn't really replicate is that they did a lot of the Diamabond trial overseas, where the rules are a little bit faster and looser. And a lot of people visited the clinical trial sites trying to see if they were legit or not. They did that kind of hardcore due diligence and couldn't get there. Pfizer, I think Pfizer took a license to it, if I'm not mistaken, just as a prayer, but let me see if I'm right about that. So in 𝐴DAS-COG in phase 2, they had a 4-point separation, but in phase 3, they had a 0.1 separation. So it just shows you that, like, in a clinical trial, the lens with which you look at the data is really important. A clinical trial is not always representative of the drug. It's very important that the study has to be designed correctly to manifest kind of what the actual effect of the drug may or may not be. For example, if, needless to say, if you did a 1-day clinical trial of almost any drug, an Alzheimer's drug or any other like long disease process, you probably won't get much of an effect. Now, there are some drugs that work very quickly, and there are some diseases that are very brief and you need them to work really quickly, say allergic attack or something like that. But for Alzheimer's, you would agree with me that it doesn't make any sense to study a drug for a single day. Just like that, there are lots of other idiosyncrasies in doing clinical trials. It also doesn't make sense to look at open label data. It also doesn't make sense to throw away the controlled withdrawal data because it wasn't good and sort of try to pretend that it doesn't exist, where the controlled withdrawal data failed. During those 6 months, Cemiplimab patients lost a point on 𝐴DAS-COG. They got worse. They didn't stay the same. They got worse. And then the same thing happened with placebo. They lost 1.5 points. They both lost.
In aggregate, right?
Of course, yeah. There is only one thing to look at. You can't
So
look after the fact.
If the drug was working and if it was doing what it intended to do, wouldn't the placebo and the actual group that's taking the drug, wouldn't there still be some after effects if it's actually truly disease modifying?
No.
Like wouldn't they
I think that theory is really kind of wild, because ultimately when you withdraw a drug, its effect stops. Otherwise, we'd love to take drugs once and never have to take them again. It's fairly rare. Remember, this drug is a very low half-life. So unless there's some like reason to believe that's explicitly the case, which there isn't, I don't see why there wouldn't. I'll give you a really good example. There was a controlled withdrawal study of Vertex's drug for cystic fibrosis. This was published. By the way, none of the Cassava data has ever been published, which is really sad. And not a good
like
sign.
the raw data?
Sorry?
Like the individual data, like the raw data itself?
No, the clinical trial.
Consolidated?
No.
Oh.
They've never published a clinical trial, like in a journal like the New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA or any of these like well-known, where basically as soon as the drug's withdrawn, you have the dramatic change. So if there was going to be a change at 6 months, there would be a change after withdrawing it as well. It doesn't make sense that they're in this terminal disease that's, rapidly progressing and is not, getting better, and then going off the drug should make it worse. I mean, there's just no doubt about that.
There's no like long-term effects of the drug that could possibly happen. I had an example before written on one of your posts that like if somebody were to exercise for a year and then stop exercising for 6 months, you would still reap the benefits of the initial exercising for the first year. Like you wouldn't just be completely back to being fat, right?
I think there would be a separation in the clinical trial, right? And there was just no separation. So in this case, they crossed.
I think there was a separation. It was just very minimal.
That's
like
fine.
it wasn't.
In the world of statistics and medicine, that's as good as that's a failure, right? There's no like runner-up for in medicine. Like it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not like they, we feel bad for you. It was close. Like if the effect size is that low that you can't hit stat sig, then the drug doesn't work. I mean, you can conclude that. I think that's the way medicine has worked. It's not fair, but it actually does make sense, and it is very fair. In fact, it's just that it's brutal and ruthless, and we all want there to be glimmers of hope in the things we do. But I've certainly learned over time that it's just not that simple. That well, the crossover patients on placebo rapidly got better in this trial. Like, it was an immediate response, and this is why those studies are really powerful. Like you can get a good sense for them, and the one chance where Cimiflam, the one place where Cimiflam was ever tested in a rigorous way, it didn't work. Like I said, this lie about the patients being stable, in this 6 month period they were not stable. Their ADAS-Cog was plummeting, just like placebo. So it's just not, it really just doesn't make sense. I have this list of other failures in Alzheimer's. Let me show them. And again, obviously, just because there have been a lot of failures in Alzheimer's doesn't mean, there's going to be a lot more failures. There's lots of diseases that eventually the breakthroughs in science penetrated. But those breakthroughs are happening logically, and they're happening with lots of people. Like Eli Lilly was at the forefront of realizing this 𝐴-beta species hypothesis. Now every other company is doing the same thing. Like, could it be that everyone's going to do filaments soon? Yeah, I guess it's possible, but it's pretty unlikely. And again, the bet is what it is. Like, it's possible that, you know, it does work, and that's fine. Here's a paper, the rise and fall of Diamabond.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you heard my question before, but I was asking, do you see any situation or any rationale as to why, if a company knew that the drug wasn't working or they didn't 100% believe in it, but they still continued to purchase shares as insiders and exercising all the warrants in completion and never selling a share, is there any reason other than to keep face for them to do that if they didn't think that drugs worked?
Well, I mean, people can think stupid things all the time. Remy was convinced that his oxycodone stuff was going to work. So, you know, it's Remy believing in something isn't exactly...
Yeah, I'm not speaking just about Remy. There's almost everybody at the company that was awarded options and purchased stocks. They haven't sold one yet since ever, I think, from what I remember.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really mean anything to me. You know, there's the shadow of all this stuff is really pretty big. It's funny, the study director or the author was this very famous Alzheimer's doctor for the Diamabond trial, which was really kind of interesting. See if you can see my screen. It says, the results of this trial were spectacular. The results of the Cassava trial were not spectacular. And the fact that this trial, all they had to do, you know, a lot of what people said on Wall Street was, all Diamabond has to do is just do half as well as it did in phase 2. And it didn't do half as well. It did 1% as well, and it didn't work. So like, unless this data was all made up, Pfizer paid $225 million for it. It ended up, again, not working. There are a lot of weird ideas about whether it could work or not, and it was just really chaotic. The lessons, this is a really good paper to read if you're a Cassava person, I think, but the failures of all the BACE inhibitors are also really illustrative. 𝗔𝗢𝗪 was a BACE inhibitor that, in fact, I had a financial interest in, believe it or not. And there's like a royalty to a company, and I owned some of that company. And here's another like really good hypothesis, just didn't work out. 𝗕𝗢𝗢𝗏 change was like the same for every group. I mean, it's going to be hard for this to succeed in that regard. Like all these drugs, like super well designed, super smart drug companies, nothing. A lot of people thought this one would have a chance, and it just didn't. What's interesting is over 6 months, the 𝗕𝗢𝗏 in the Cassava study dropped, let me see here, it dropped 1 point for placebo, 1.5 points for placebo, and 1 point for drug. And if you look at 6 months here, 6 times 4 is 24, that's almost exactly the amount that 𝗕𝗢𝗏 dropped in this study and other studies I've seen. So it's like pretty typical after around 24 weeks, 𝗕𝗢𝗏 drops 1 or 2 points. And that's what happened in this trial, but everyone dropped. So half a point of 𝗕𝗢𝗏 isn't enough to move the needle, even if they could somehow get like a massive sample size and get it, because the sigma, or the standard deviation around it, is so much larger than the effect size that you're really dealing with like just too minuscule of a difference, I think.